We have a true crime media industrial complex that is really fixated on the murder and death and disappearance of certain types of people. Gabby Petito, while what's happened to her is absolutely tragic, fits that mold. And so her case got this disproportionate reaction that most missing and murdered people don't see.
Time to talk about the big topic at hand. Alyssa, I want to start with a sort of light question to get us into this heavy topic. Mm-hmm. When you were growing up, and I guess currently, did you ever want to be a detective?
Girl, I am a detective. I'm like Nancy Drew meets Ramona Quimby every day, and I'm 45. Solving mysteries is, it's an exciting thing to try to do.
Yeah, you know what? I think I wanted to be a detective too, but then, because I watched Ghost Writer religiously when I was a kid, the PBS show about the joy of writing. Actually, now one of our Hysteria co-host's sister was one of the cast members of the original.
Really?
Yeah, Tien. Tien's sister played Tina on Ghost Writer.
Shit.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Anyway, I loved that show because I wanted to live in a world where I could go around solving mysteries, but also be insulated from the real danger that solving actual mysteries can bring, which is a serious threat of bodily harm, especially if you're a child going around trying to figure out crimes.
It's like low-key Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah, it is. Totally low-key Murder, She Wrote. But, I feel like a lot of people kind of want to be sleuths, want to help out. Sometimes that manifests in a way that is actually helpful. Sometimes that manifests in a way that is sort of a reflection of a bunch of social shortcomings. And we're going to talk about the ins and outs of how that manifests today. We're going to talk about the Gabby Petito disappearance and death. And we're going to talk about why it has so dominated the national conversation. So I want to bring in the rest of the panel. I'm so excited for this conversation today, guys. First, she is an author and activist, and nobody suffers fools less gladly than she does. Julissa Arce.
Hi. I'm glad to be here for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're here. Did you ever want to grow up to be a detective?
Yes, and I feel like every guy I ever met probably knows what a good detective I am. Give me his name. I will find out.
We're all sort of DIY PIs in the age of social media, especially if you're like a woman who has female friends who date shady men, and you're like, I'm going to figure out what's going on here. It's great. Good skill to have. And next, when this story that we're going to talk about today started percolating in the news, my first thought is we have to get this person on the show to talk about this. I'm delighted to have Rebecca Nagle today. Most of you know her from the podcast This Land. Some of you know her from her journalism work. She is a member of Cherokee Nation and a longtime advocate to address violence facing Native women. Rebecca, I want to start with you. I'm going to start with a joke question and then ask you a real question. First, do we think it's possible that John Mulaney had something to do with this? Because before the Gabby Petito case, my social media feeds were like 50% home sleuthing about John Mulaney's divorce. And then when the Gabby Petito case came up, all of a sudden it was all Gabby Petito and no John Mulaney. I'm just asking questions. For legal purposes, I don't think John Mulaney killed Gabby Petito. He doesn't seem like he'd be comfortable outdoors. Okay, on a serious note though. Over the last several weeks, for better or for worse, the case of Gabby Petito's disappearance and death following the, suspicious disappearance of her boyfriend has dominated certain corners of the media space and the social media space, even as other women go missing every day with little, if any, attention. So what accounts for this? Is it as simple as missing white woman syndrome, or is there more at play here?
I think that that's what it is. We have a true crime media industrial complex that is really fixated on the murder and death and disappearance of certain types of people. Gabby Petito, while what's happened to her is absolutely tragic, fits that mold. And so her case got this disproportionate reaction that most missing and murdered people don't see, and that's both within the media response, the public outcry, and then that also equaled real police resources, in response to her disappearance that, particularly in my community, when Native people go missing, we don't see that kind of response. But it also happens in other communities, when members of the LGBTQ community, particularly trans women, experience violence, when other communities of color experience violence, there's not the same kind of public outcry. And I think that can sound like we're in competition with each other, that the Gabby Petitos of the world should get less recognition. But I don't think that the coverage of her case helps prevent another young white woman from being potentially murdered by her boyfriend. We're not learning about the warning signs of escalating domestic violence and relationship violence. We're not learning how patterns of domestic violence escalate to violence like murder. We're not learning any of that stuff. We're learning kind of the murder mystery version of it. And I think that that's what a lot of the kind of true crime industrial complex is built around entertainment. It's not built around raising awareness about the underlying cultural norms and structures and institutions that create this type of violence.
Julissa, what do you think coverage would look like if it did actually address the causes of violence against people like Gabby Petito and the, dozens to hundreds of unnamed women that we never learn about?
Yeah, I was thinking about how in the United States, there aren't really any statistics for femicide. So violence and crimes that are committed against women because they are women, right? And we don't have any real statistics about that. In other countries, statistics specifically around femicide exist. And here we don't have that. So I think part of the problem is that we don't really understand the magnitude of the problem, because when a woman dies, we can never truly identify it as this was a homicide committed by her partner. It was a crime because she is a woman. So I think the first step is that we need to have those better statistics. I was also, when I was reading through the various statistics, it was really interesting to me that Hispanic women, quote unquote Hispanic women, were lumped in with white women. So there wasn't even a separate statistic for Latina women. And as a Latina, I would love to know what is the magnitude of the problem and what is the magnitude of the problem in my own community. So I think part of that responsibility doesn't necessarily lie with the media, but I do think that the media has a responsibility to not be lazy and to dig more into some of these problems. And I do think we're missing a really great opportunity that whether it's a white woman or a Black woman or a Latina woman or an indigenous woman, when those tragedies happen, that we do take the opportunity to educate the public about those signs that Rebecca was talking about. I mean, I'll share something personal here, which is that I was in a really abusive relationship in the past. And I remember I used to watch Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, like religiously. And in one of the episodes, they said that when a man chokes a woman violently, right, not in like any kinky kind of way, that's the next step. The next step is murder, right? And I don't know whether that's actually true or not because I watched it on a television show. But let me tell you that when that happened to me, when he choked me, that was like, okay, what the fuck am I doing? I need to get out of this situation. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if we did talk about those things, then maybe it would help to prevent not just, white women, but like every woman from being victims of these types of really vicious crimes. So I think there's a lot that we as a society and as consumers of media need to do, because if the media, like the national media, is not talking about it, then we can use social media for good and we can share other stories. We can share these resources. So, when people are sharing this particular case, why don't we add a slide about the warning signs? Why don't we add a slide about resources that women can tap into to get out of these situations and to know those warning signs?
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really sorry that happened to you, Julissa.
Thank you.
And it's such a good point that bystander intervention is taught as a thing that we don't do until after somebody dies. Like bystander intervention is like true crime sleuths, like looking for clues about where the van was, not, trying to identify this is wrong. And as somebody witnessing behavior of a violent nature from a man to a romantic partner that's a woman, like, what can I do? We don't really have very much of that training. Alyssa, I was texting with you about this yesterday. I went down a deep Gabby Petito rabbit hole, not because I need to know more about the case, but I just wanted to see how people were talking about the case. And so I listened to a bunch of Nancy Grace, which was crazy. It was like fan fiction about her autopsy from a bunch of people who hadn't examined her body. And then I ended up finding a video of people gathering outside of Gabby Petito's ex-boyfriend Brian Laundrie's parents' house with bullhorns, yelling about them being aiding and abetting a murder. And we don't really know what, if anything, they did. We just see that now they're being harassed, and they might have had something to do with it, but we don't know, and I was watching this and I thought it sort of reminds me of what we see, at town hall meetings, and sort of reminds me of what we see at like school board meetings, or people really distrusting institutions and taking it upon themselves to like enact justice. Do you think that this is ultimately helpful to anybody?
There are some interesting things about this case that are, and I don't mean voyeuristically, interesting, but, some of the things that I have taken away from some of the reporting is that the things we've been talking about more and more over the past 10, 15 years are kind of breaking through. People did try to intervene. Like, so much of what is known, which I think is why some of it, the white missing woman aside, is that in the middle of, Wyoming, people heard her being yelled at. They saw him mistreating her. They called the police. It is a little bit, I found that kind of heartening that at least some people were like, see something, say something, I know what's happening is not right. I think that people want justice, right? I think like over the past, let's say since just the beginning of COVID, which also, coincides with 4 years of Trump, people just want to see bad people fucking put away. And in their mind, if they're out there with a bullhorn, I think they think they're helping, or they're going to crack the case, or they're going to drive them to the brink where they confess and they come outside and they're like, I don't want you yelling at me with a bullhorn anymore. I'll tell you where he is, which is like, not to be junior Nancy Grace here, but he ain't in the Everglades, all right? He's in a non-extradition country, in my opinion. I just think that people, because of the true crime industrial complex, as Rebecca said, it's like everybody sees some level of romance in solving a crime. Like, everybody wants to feel like a hero. Everybody wants to feel like a good Samaritan. Even if you're a terrible person, you kind of want to feel like you did something good. And so I feel like the people standing out with the bullhorns are both, they're like a melange of all these things. It's like they think they're going to drive the parents out. They think that somehow by doing this, they're going to help solve the case. And, I think that's kind of what it comes down to. The fact that people were leaving a shrine to Gabby at the parents' house, at the fiance's house. It's like, that's all I got. That's all I got.
I do think that sometimes it does take one person really caring to make a difference. And I've been listening to this podcast called In Your Own Backyard. It's basically revisiting the disappearance of Kristen Smart, who disappeared like 20 years ago from Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. And the really frustrating part about listening to this podcast is just how long it even took for police to take it seriously, how long it took them to really believe that this person was missing and not just like basically slut shaming her, saying, you know, she was at a party, she's probably over at some boy's house this weekend. And so by the time that the police really paid attention, it was a little too late. And it's been 20 years, right? And from the beginning, there's been sort of like a prime suspect, but never enough evidence to like bring him and convict him or to even like arrest him. And 20 years later, this guy did this podcast and spent a lot of time and resources investigating the case. And because of social media, because of cell phones now, the family that was involved with the disappearance of Kristen Smart, and they have been arrested now, they were talking about it on their phones. And so police were able to like get a hold of these conversations on their phones. And now 20 years later, I think finally there will be some justice for Kristen Smart. So I do think that sometimes it's helpful, and it takes like one person not forgetting that this injustice happened. But obviously, you know, he didn't just like go scream at somebody's parents' house. Like, he was very methodical in how he did it and spent a lot of time and resources. And in that case, it was really helpful. And I'm glad someone did it, because how is it possible that for 20 years there was no justice for this woman?
Rebecca, one thing that I have seen is, you know, we have people who are kind of, like Julissa mentioned, like dogged pursuers of justice through appropriate channels. But we also have this real prevalence of sort of detective LARPing that happens on social media. And, you know, I was thinking about missing white woman syndrome and, you know, all the attention paid to this case. And then I was thinking, if that amount of attention and if that sort of like detective LARPing were aimed at the case of like a missing Native woman from Wyoming, would that actually help? Like, what is the ideal amount of attention given to cases that where women go missing and the police aren't necessarily able to find what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. You know, oftentimes those people for the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women who are trying to get answers, who are organizing their own search parties, who are raising funds for search parties, are family members and community members. And I think that that's another layer of the trauma, is that after losing a family member, it's on that family to search for them because there's just not the same level of police response. And so there was a really, really good study by the Urban Indian Health Institute that they put out a few years ago that they did specifically on missing and murdered Indigenous women in urban areas. And they looked at about over 500 cases and really just kind of logged what happened with those cases. And over 95% of those cases had no media coverage at all. And of the ones that did, a third of the coverage referenced drugs or alcohol. A third of the coverage referenced the victim's criminal history, and a third of the coverage that involved a victim that was transgendered, misgendered the victim. And so that's the kind of coverage that missing and murdered Indigenous people are getting. And the same thing is mirrored in the government response. So in 2016, 5,712 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls were counted by the Urban Indian Health Institute, and then they compared that to the Department of Justice National Database, and only 116 of those cases had been logged nationally. And so, and you can see the same thing in Wyoming, you know, where Gabby Petito's body was found. In the past decade, 710 Indigenous people have gone missing, and those Indigenous people are twice as likely than white folks in the state to be missing more than 30 days. And so, you know, it's at every layer where there's the amount of attention and public outcry that the media gives. And then there's also the police response, and I would say that like we have our famous cases that as a community, as Native people, we're all aware of, whether it's like Olivia Lone Bear or Savannah Greywind, like that Native people are all talking about, but you don't see the same kind of coverage or the same kind of attention in non-Native media. And so, and it's mirrored in the police response where, because the police are like, well, that person, because of XYZ reason, she probably just went missing, she probably just ran away, or she probably just went and did this. They're not even considering that a crime may have occurred. And so then it's on family members and community members for them to try and take it seriously. And so, I think that there's a lot that needs to change structurally. And I think that's too, like, one of the things that's frustrating about the way the media functions. Like, we have this kind of media cycle where we're going to spend all of this energy on one case, and there's not the same amount of attention and depth and breadth of coverage of just the crisis of violence in general. And so we're not covering it in a way where people can really understand the problem. We're just getting into the details of this one very specific case, which just, that family deserves answers. It deserves to be solved. Like, all of these cases deserves answers and deserve to be solved. But if we're going to fixate our public attention on something, I wish it could be the systemic issues that lead to this type of violence.
And also, it seems like there's a problem with policing. Like, that we have like a goldfish brain about the fact that police drop the ball a lot on these cases. And a lot of the reason that they drop the ball is because they can. They have a constitutionally protected right to not do anything. And I'm not exaggerating. The Supreme Court case, Gonzalez versus the town of Castle Rock, which Rebecca is nodding because I'm sure she's familiar with, basically found that a woman, Jessica Gonzalez, who had a restraining order against her husband, who was abusive to her, requested protection from the police. The police did not respond. Her estranged husband showed up at the police station with his gun drawn. The police killed him, and then in his car, they found all 3 of her children murdered. The police did not respond to her contacting them and saying, this guy is violating my restraining order. Ended up with her 3 children dead and her estranged husband. The Supreme Court ruled that Gonzalez had no constitutionally protected property interest in the enforcement of the restraining order. So in other words, the cops don't have to protect anybody. And that was a domestic violence case. And, I think that every time we're like, wow, the police, go to the police. It's like, yeah, but the police don't always do what they're supposed to do. And Julissa, you mentioned femicide. I know that we're coming up on an anniversary. It's the day that this show airs is Vanessa Guillen's 22nd birthday. And you emailed about wanting to talk about this case. I wonder what the Vanessa Guillen case brings to mind in the context of this Gabby Petito conversation that we're currently having.
There's a couple things. So for those that, and I can bet you anything that some of our listeners have probably never heard of the case of Vanessa Guillen. Vanessa Guillen was a 20-year-old private soldier who disappeared from Fort Hood. She disappeared from a military base. I cannot stress that enough. She was on the military base one moment, the next she was disappeared. And again, the police response, and in this case, it was military police response, was incredibly inadequate. No one really paid attention to this. Rebecca talked about sort of the onus being on the family, and that's exactly what happened in this case. The only reason that this case was getting any attention early on was because the family was at For Hood, protesting, marching. It became sort of within, I think, Latino circles on social media. We all knew about it, but nobody was talking about it on the national stage. And her remains were ultimately found on June 30th. So she disappeared on April 22nd. Her remains were found on June 30th. Not very far away from the military base. And it took months for her body to be found. It took weeks and weeks and weeks for police to pay any attention to this. And, I really want to uplift her story, because September 30th would have been her 22nd birthday. She was incredibly young. No one deserves she was dismembered. And it pains me so much that so little attention was given to her case. And when I think about the type of quote unquote victim that she was a beautiful young woman, a soldier, right? We talk about sort of like giving to the country and caring for veterans. And here she was a quote unquote perfect victim, except for the fact that she was Latina. I really, truly believe that. And when you talk about this Supreme Court case, I do wonder, Erin, if that victim had been white, might that outcome from the Supreme Court have been different?
She was
white. And the reason I mentioned that,
she was white. Yeah, she was married to.
Okay, well, there you go.
But that feeds the point, which is like, even people that are like, you would think because of injustice, like would be the beneficiaries of protection, are not. And like the more the more removed they are from the privilege of race, of class, the less likely they are to get even the meager protections that are offered to people.
And the reason I brought that up, and I'm sorry I didn't know that, is because, we have a real opportunity with the Vanessa Guillen case to create some systemic change for other women and other people who are victims of sexual harassment in the military. And so right now through Congress, the I Am Vanessa Guillen case, it's making its way through Congress. There is bipartisan support for this bill that would take the investigations of these types of case outside of the military command, because that's one of the big that was one of the big problems in this case, is that everybody investigating it was sort of part of the problem, right? Ultimately, there were like 14 different people who were fired from the military as a result of their mishandling of the case, and so we have a real opportunity so that Vanessa Guillen didn't die in vain, so that her family not only gets justice for their own daughter, but for other potential victims within the military. I mean, in 2019, the Pentagon reported that 20,500 service members experienced sexual assault in the military. And in Fort Hood, especially, there have been reports, like rampant reports of abuse at that particular military base. And so as we're talking about, not just talking about these cases because they're salacious, but actually doing something about it, I really urge and encourage all of our listeners to call their congressperson on the day of Vanessa Guillen's birthday and tell them that they need to pass the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act. That's what we need. We need action and we need systemic change.
And Julissa, the Senate counterpart to that bill is the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act of 2021. And Senator Gillibrand, who's been on our show a bunch of times, is the lead sponsor of that bill. And it seems like something pretty insane that it hasn't been passed yet. This seems like some low-hanging fruit that the Senate and the Congress could just fucking get right.
I mean, I absolutely hate this guy, but like literally even Ted Cruz has said he supports this bill. So what's happening? Let's get this thing passed.
Alyssa, that kind of brings up the Violence Against Women Act, which is, I think up to be reinstated or renewed. Do you think that the Violence Against Women Act has helped the problems that are at the root of femicide, of women going missing, of women and what's at stake if it's not renewed?
For sure. I mean, well, first of all, how is this just not like permanently funded? You know, like, why do we have to go through this reauthorization, whatever the fuck it is, every couple of years? You know, one of the funny things, not funny, but something that when we go back in time, one of the biggest sponsors of VAWA in the beginning was Lifetime TV. And they actually went down and lobbied to get this bill passed. You know, back when I was in college, I took some interesting courses, including forensic pathology and rural sociology. And what you found out in rural, and this is 1994, you guys, so it's a while ago, but relevant still. Women surveyed in rural communities understood what domestic violence was and that it wasn't okay if they had a television and they watched Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah was the reason that any of these women in this survey understood that someone hurting you is not okay. And so I think the roots, you know, of VAWA, they tried in the beginning, like the bar was so low. It's like, let's help women. Let's get them out of bad situations. Let's help fund shelters, you know, and all of this. So I definitely think it has helped. I think it absolutely needs to be reauthorized. I just don't know. I don't understand how something like this is something that keeps coming up. I mean, this should just be a permanent part of who we are.
I mean, and like, you know, look to your left, look to your right. We're all women here. There's a lot of us. There's a lot of women in this country. We're half of the voting population. And there are people also, you know, in smaller numbers that are non-binary or like have a different gender identity, but they're not men. And they often also tend to be the victims of violence that is gendered. And like, I don't understand how the needs of so many people can be ignored for so long, because I think regardless of the fact that the media got a little over its skis with its coverage of the Gabby Petito case, and they will get over their skis with the coverage of the next pretty white girl who goes missing. The issues at the root of it that we've all kind of been touching on are issues that are at the root of a lot of women's disappearances. And Rebecca, I would love to hear what your vision is for, you know, how can we talk about this in our peer groups? You know, if there's a case that's fascinating, how do we broaden the conversation to be about things that are bigger than just a quote unquote influencer in a van?
Yeah. First, I just wanted to mention there are a couple really important things for Native women in the current bill for VAWA. So one of the reasons that violence against Native women is so high, and children and men and non-binary and our two-spirit relatives is so high, is because tribes don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Native people who commit crimes on our reservation. So if you wanted to come onto my reservation and commit murder or steal a car or steal a pack of gum from the grocery store, my tribal court system couldn't prosecute you for that crime. And that has led to a utter crisis of violence in Indian country. And the federal government has jurisdiction. U.S. attorneys have a really high rate of not prosecuting those cases. So basically, abusers have learned that reservations are this place where they have refuge and basically can do these crimes with impunity. And so in the 2013 reauthorization, tribes' jurisdiction over domestic violence and dating violence was restored by that act in this very narrow way. So like literally a tribe could take somebody who was abusing their partner and they're also abusing a child, and they can now prosecute that person for domestic violence but not child abuse. Or say when that case finally went to trial, they were intimidating the person they abused, the tribe can't prosecute them for witness intimidation, but they can prosecute them for domestic abuse. So the new bill with VAWA allows tribes to prosecute co-concurrent crimes that happen with domestic violence, and also sexual assault and sex trafficking, which is really, really important. Our tribes also don't get the same kind of like funding streams that local cities and counties have. So even just our ability to prosecute people is limited by that, especially with smaller tribes. And so that kind of funding streams and these big big congressional bills for tribes to be included in that is also really important. And then I think, like in changing the conversation, I think we just have to fundamentally change how we talk about rape and abuse in this country. And I think that the way the Gabby Petito case has been covered really highlights that. Whereas like we think of rape and abuse as something that is committed by bad individuals and that it's like this interpersonal problem, right? And so like the problem isn't our society or our culture or our laws, it's Gabby Petito's fiance. Like he's this bad guy. And I think that that's honestly part of the fixation on these high profile cases, because they tell a story where we can focus on the boyfriend or we can focus on the fiance, and we don't have to focus on the bigger systemic issues. And really, rape and abuse aren't things that happen in a vacuum and aren't things that happen by a bad set of individuals, but we have a society that creates situations where people are vulnerable. And where people are vulnerable, you see really, really, really high rates of violence. So like the military, where the chain of command for justice or the route for survivors for justice is kept within the chain of command. You think about churches, you think about universities, and across the board, any group of people in the United States who are more vulnerable are more likely to experience rape. Any group, people with disabilities, trans people, LGBTQ people, children are more likely to experience rape than adults because they have less rights in our country. And so if we really want to solve this problem, it's not about arresting the person who murdered Gabby Petito. It's about making sure that every person has equal access to justice, because as long as that is unequal, there are people who will take advantage of that. And I think that the media cycle around this idea that justice is getting one person is a way for us to actually avoid the harder conversation.
That is a great thought to end this discussion on. Thank you so much, both of you, Julissa and Rebecca, for stopping by. That was such a good conversation. Alyssa, thank you, as always, for being my ride or die. And thanks to all of you, the listeners. I know we talked about some heavy stuff this week. If you or somebody you know is facing a difficult situation, a domestic violence situation, you can contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org, or you can call 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-SAFE. Stay safe out there, and there will be more Hysteria for you next week.